Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining from. You're with the Build Back Better from Seed to Supply Chain webinar hosted by Sustainability in collaboration with the Zayed Sustainability Prize. Thanks so much for joining us, which may be your lunch hour for some. So we do hope you have potentially a lunch or at least a beverage, glass of water, or something stronger to keep you going. Thanks again for joining us. This is the second webinar in a series this week in collaboration with the prize, and the topic today is food and agriculture. We're going to be speaking to our esteemed panel. You can see joining me by video here and hear their insights into how to build back better for everything related to food and agriculture, all the exciting innovations that we see happening and that we expect and hope to come in the world of food and agriculture. Next slide, please. We'll make a start. Just a quick word about me. I'm Denise Delaney, would be your facilitator for the next hour. Partner Sustainability, which is an ERM group company. And if you don't know us, we're a think tank and strategy consultancy working to inspire transformative business leadership on the sustainability agenda. So pleased that you were able to join us today. Also really delighted to be joined by such great speakers and panelists here. So I'm just going to invite each of them, perhaps in the order on the slide here, starting with Helen, just to unmute and say hello and who you are.
Hi, yes, good afternoon to everyone. I'm Helen Munday. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at the Food and Drink Federation in the UK, and I'm delighted that I've also been a judge on the Zayed Sustainability competition for the last couple of years.
Fantastic, thanks for having Rob.
Yeah, thanks, Denise, and hello everybody that's been able to join us. My name is Rob Cameron. I'm the Global Head of Public Affairs here at Nestle. Relatively recent in the role, been here for just a little over 3 months, and formerly a colleague of Denise's with sustainability.
Thanks, Rob. And Sabrina.
Thanks, Denise. So hi, everyone. My name is Sabrina Gonçalves Krebsbach. I'm the Agricultural Commodities Specialist at WWF-UK. Also quite new to the role. I've been here for a couple of months, and I work across our efforts to tackle deforestation and conversion in agricultural supply chains. I'm really delighted to be here today.
Well, we're delighted to have all of you. Really stellar lineup and happy. Well, I'm really pleased to get into it. A little bit of introduction. If we go to our next slide, so we'll come back to all of you in a moment. A little bit of framing and setup here. So if you hadn't heard of or you're wondering more about the Zayed Sustainability Prize, it is the UAE's pioneering global award in sustainability and a tribute to the legacy of the late founding father of the UAE. Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan himself. It was established in 2008 and it has evolved over the years. So it started very much focused on energy, and over the years it was broadened into the fields of health, food and water as well. And there's also a global high schools program related to it as well. And it's really trying to drive reward and help support the innovation. So people, pioneers, entrepreneurs, those great ideas that are driving impactful, innovative, and inspiring sustainability solutions in these areas. And they have extended the application deadline, given all of the challenge that the world has had around the pandemic. So we've had more time for those applications until the 11th of June. So if you are in a startup or a nonprofit or other organization driving some really innovative work, we do encourage you to go to the website and find out more. If you go to the next slides, just a little bit more content there. I think important to understand that the prize really takes as its framing the Sustainable Development Agenda, and very specifically the Sustainable Development Goals. So through that lens, it's looking for, the key criteria here are innovation, some of the most innovative ideas, high impact, and inspirational. So again, if you fit the bill, hopefully you can potentially get involved. So we want to take the opportunity to really shine a light on the key areas that are so important for development, and really underscored by the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that the imperative to meet them is really clear as we sit here in 2020 as a kind of landmark year with 10 years to go to meet that agenda. I think hopefully everyone joining will be clear or familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals as an agenda that was set in 2015 by the UN to guide not only countries, but also calling on governments, business and civil society on the role that they have to play in achieving all these incredible aspirations that we need to, whether it's no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, etc. We go to the next slide. We just wanted to not cover all the different interconnections that are are certainly embedded in part of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but specifically just look briefly at least at one that is directly relevant to today's conversation, often termed the food goal, SDG 2 around zero hunger. Let's put that into context. It's specifically about ending hunger, achieving food security, and improved nutrition, and promoting sustainable agriculture. You'll see here some really stark statistics if you're not looking at the visual here. 820 million people going to bed hungry regularly, 135 million suffering from acute hunger, and more worryingly, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, that number of those acutely hungry it's set to double according to the World Food Program. So there's the challenge of the SDGs that was set in 2015 for us to achieve in 2030, and I think in the case of food and ag, we're certainly going to see some exacerbation of the challenge as well. Wanted to touch on, rather than get into the detail of all the different important targets that sit under the SDG, just some of the broader concepts that we've been observing in the food landscape more broadly, and some of these will be familiar, hopefully, with some of the reading and other sources there that you see out there, particularly though firstly around ecosystem loss. So what we know is that as the population grows, as demand for food is going up, food production is going up, and that is at the moment coming at a cost to ecosystem. It's leading to a loss of species. We know from some of the work from WWF that human food production is directly related to that, and land is certainly suffering as we grapple with meeting the greater needs that we have. I'm sure we'll get into more of this in a moment. Moving on, so we've got the ecosystem loss. We also know at a very different end of the spectrum here, packaging and food waste continue to be challenges that societies are grappling with. So on the one hand, we can actually add up the global costs of food waste, adding up to about $1 trillion a year, which is phenomenal. And we also have challenges around the packaging with the really keen attention from lots of stakeholders, including consumers, around plastic specifically, but more broadly, packaging, and particularly single-use packaging, making up something like a quarter of residential waste, for instance. So interested to see what's innovating there. From a nutrition perspective in diets, unfortunately, and this is just to select one of the challenges we're facing, we're not necessarily getting healthier. Our diets are a challenge, and to focus on obesity here is risen dramatically, tenfold in the last 40 years, and is not simply a challenge in particular countries or markets. It's really affecting just about every country in a big way. We know, the number of those who are overweight and obese, more than 900 million. We also are seeing it's connected, it's a risk factor for other conditions and diseases as well. So it's a worrying trend in our world. Finally, and we mentioned already, we're obviously speaking in the context of a pandemic, and COVID-19 has generally been a shock to all kinds of systems, and not least our food systems, which have been impacted from the labor that's required in many systems, and the movement of people, through to logistics of getting food to where the demand is, into overrun grocery stores, and even closed markets where those have been essential routes to food and nutrition. So these are all just some of the big concepts that we know are at play in the food landscape that we might be picking up here, but want to move it into some of the opportunity here and the solutions that we're starting to see. And again, these are just some of the ideas. This is by no means exhaustive, but we know that there's certainly attention being paid to pre-production solutions. So what's happening in the agricultural space in terms of seeds, crop protection products, different practices that could perhaps potentially be higher yield and better for ecosystems. That's one perhaps bucket we might get into. That's trying to optimize the design of food chains. So there's the perishable nature of foods. How can we avoid quality degrading, any food losses and waste, as we've already mentioned. There's also transparency dimensions to this. So tech for transparency here, there's a lot of talk of blockchain potentially being really game-changing in terms of the supply chain, but also perhaps in other dimensions over time. I'm curious if our speakers are inspired by technology, if it will be the silver bullet or not that we might hope. There's also the broader concept of going circular, so implementing circular thinking to address what have been historically some systemic limitations around our our food systems, if you like? Are there opportunities to do more with what's traditionally been termed food waste? Are we wasting viable food? Is there more that we can do with actual food waste as well in terms of energy and other systems? And finally, this term of holistic approaches, and I think by that what we mean is almost the holy grail or the real prize of actually being able to balance perhaps biodiversity and protecting ecosystems, better diets, more resilient supply chains, the whole package, and seeing that as a systemic whole as opposed to some of its constituent parts. So with that, hopefully just a little bit of inspiration, seed the discussion, no pun intended there. I do want to invite each of our speakers to just share a little bit about their organizations and what they're doing by way of a deeper introduction before we move into some questions certainly that I have, and we'll be keeping an eye on the Q&A chat for all the participants. If you have any questions, please do put them there. We will be bringing them into the discussion. I was going to turn to Helen first just to get a better sense from you really of how the food and drink sector is learning from the pandemic and how it's been responding to the current crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to go to the next slide, I've just summarized really on here some of the activities that we've been doing over the last few weeks. And I suppose despite the fact that in the wider geography, from Asia, we did see that there was something coming. In actual fact, I think the onset of a complete change in the way that we had to operate, for most people, felt like it came very quickly. And so there were some massive changes that we saw in the shopping habits, particularly of citizens in the UK, and I'm sure in Europe. I think early on, it felt like a little bit that people were panic buying and that they were buying really bizarre things. But as the weeks have gone on, some of those shopping habits have really become quite significant in their longevity and their impact that they've had. So certainly in the UK, people had, for the last few years, have been doing quite a lot of small shops, top-up shops. They just pop down, get things that they needed. And that has changed quite dramatically in the last few weeks, where we're seeing people shopping less frequently and buying more items. And of course, we know that online shopping has had a complete change in the importance of it, in the way that many people are getting their shopping, not only from established retailers, but also, of course, through non-traditional outlets as well. And there have been some supply chain disruptions. Certainly, things like pasta in the early days was quite problematic when Italy was struggling so much, but also some fine chemicals and things, and vitamins and various other supplements that come from China. It's been our #1 priority, I think, to make sure that keeping safe, nutritious and affordable food on the tables has been at the pinnacle of what we've been trying to achieve. And we've seen some very encouraging signs, I think, that there are ways that people have adapted, which we hope will have some legacies, especially things like on food waste. Other key things that we've been working on have been ensuring that key workers can operate safely. So, of course, the nurses and the doctors in the health services are the most important key workers. But it's been a big challenge for retailers and manufacturers to adapt their operations so that those who are their employees can work safely, that they've got any personal protective equipment they need, and that they can balance the supply of safe food with the operators being safe as well, because those two things are actually quite difficult to do at the same time. And of course, there's the importance of keeping businesses in business. We know how much the governments are having to do to support businesses, and we've been ensuring that our member companies, as we're a representative organisation, always have access to the latest information, whether it's on business support or how to work safely, and also ensuring that recognition comes for those who are doing extraordinary things. And we've supported a couple of hashtags, hashtag hidden heroes and hashtag food heroes, to ensure those in the food chain are getting the recognition behind the health workers, of course. And that letter on the right-hand side of this slide was just early on in the pandemic, a letter from the Minister thanking those in food for the support they're giving. Go to the next slide. I think, obviously, as we go forward, I think we can safely assume that tomorrow won't be the same as yesterday. There will be profound changes to the way we do things, which will have been informed by what we have been through. I think it's a bit like in a medical sense, if someone goes through a big illness, often their body is remodeled, and I think our food system will be remodeled, and it won't be the same as it was before. And it's important that we learn from the crisis and look at how society is likely to change, and that we can innovate to support those changes in the long run. And there are some things I think we will look at differently, such as the role of packaging. So I think I know a lot of the supermarkets are working on the kind of bending through, like the breakfast cereals and the rice and things. I'm not sure that's something that, at least for the immediate future, is going to be something we will be able to do. It's a popular thing to do. So that's probably we're going to reframe a few things. So, you know, it's a dreadful thing that we've been through. I think we've adapted, and now it's going to be important to try and capture those things that we now feel differently about, to understand what the future is going to look like.
Excellent, absolutely. So lots of good food for thought there, Helen, that we will definitely want to come back to and get some more thoughts on. So thank you for that. Do you want to give an opportunity? I think moving here to Rob. Yes, any introductory comments on really what you've been seeing at Nestle, which we know was, you know, it's been an incredibly busy time for obvious reasons, and what innovations you've been seeing crop up, and particularly interested if there's anything that has come up in the context of the pandemic that you think will actually have lasting impact or be really useful, well, beyond pandemic circumstances.
Yeah, thanks, Denise, and thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I think there's a couple of things to build on what Helen has said. Actually, I mean, the first thing is that obviously the pandemic really first hit out in China, and we have quite a lot of operations over there, so we had some sort of sense of what was coming. And you know, this is a company that has got quite a lot of inbuilt resilience in it, and so we were quite prepared from a very early stage. And really, what we said right from the outset was there were three things that mattered most. The first is take care of our people, and so as Helen said about, you know, people working in the food system, you know, we were very, very quick with thinking about protecting people's safety at work, the distancing measures, PPE, but not just the physical safety. There's also a lot of work that's been done around ensuring employee well-being, around giving people confidence because of the sick pay arrangements that we made, the fact that any interruptions, people were guaranteed their 12 weeks, full 12 weeks of employment of pay, as it were, and then also in terms of, you know, loans and things like that, you know, so cash advances. So take care of your people first. That was the first thing. The second thing was absolutely a focus on the supply chain and making sure that that shelves and pantries could be kept stocked. And the supply chains actually have proven to be fairly resilient. There have been the odd shortage here and there, but pretty much on the whole, we've been able to weather that. So keeping those shelves and pantries full has been the second focus. And the third focus has been the humanitarian response. And I think one of the things that's been super interesting for me has been our choice of partner. And this is based on, again, an existing thing that we already had, which is a partnership with the Red Cross, Red Crescent, which has a very similar decentralized structure to Nestle. And through that partnership, we've been able to do a huge amount of work on the ground, both in terms of food donations, but also in terms of cash donations as well. So those are the three sort of key components of the response: take care of people, make sure the supply chain keeps running, and really focus on lending a hand where we can. The other thing which I think hasn't been talked about too much so far, which I think is also worth referencing, is that the out-of-home sector has been massively affected, of course. And a lot of people do depend on the out-of-home sector, both for their employment or for as their business, but a lot of people also in terms of where they have traditionally sourced their food from. We've seen this in the UK, particularly with the dairy supply chain, but across the world, a lot of dairy farmers have been very badly affected by the drop-off, and that's one of the things that we focused on very, very much, is making sure that dairy farmers, all those contracts that we had with dairy farmers have all been totally fulfilled, regardless of whether that milk was ever going to get used or not. We fulfilled all of those contracts exactly as we should do, and I'm really pleased that we're able to say that. We've also made huge investments in our out-of-home customers. People in the restaurant trade, in the hotel catering trade, that depend upon Nestle for their products. It's astonishing the amount of investment that we put in that, in the sense of it's actually fully 500 million Swiss francs worth of support in terms of delayed payments, suspension of payments, of rental payments, and so on. Adds up to a substantial investment there. I think in terms of, when we're thinking about what next, one of the things we're also very clear about in this company, and I'm sure any right-minded company is thinking this way too, we've seen the evidence from Edelman and their consumer surveys that consumers are absolutely looking at which businesses have made a difference, which businesses have stepped forward and made a difference and supported in their communities, which businesses and their leaders that have come forward and made an effort on this crisis. And I'm fairly sure that those companies and those companies that have not responded, will stand to be punished. I think, if I remember correctly, the number is something like 68% of people surveyed reckoned that they probably would punish a company with their future purchasing habits if they felt that they'd not responded in an appropriate way to the crisis as we see it. So that's a kind of consumer lens on things. But we're thinking also then about, well, what next? Access to nutrition and affordability of nutrition. We see this globally. It's been a concern of ours for some years to ensure that the product range that we have is accessible and affordable. And that's something that we are looking to accelerate still further in the months and years ahead. So you can expect to see something coming through on that in the next 6 months or so. And then the final thread in terms of, well, what does this all mean in terms of our thinking? I think that one of the aspects of the sustainability agenda that was very much to the forefront in the early days of the agenda was how a company takes care of its employees. And somehow or other, that's fallen a little bit out of fashion. And so, the S in ESG, if we want to use that language, has not really been perhaps focused upon quite so much by investors, for instance. I was on an investor call this morning, and actually the S of ESG very much to the fore, and not just the social dimension in a general sense, but the people dimension of the folk that work in your company. And I think we're going to see a great deal more attention on that aspect of the sustainability agenda in future. And I think that then will spill on also on the people agenda. I just want to say a word about youth. Young people have been disproportionately affected and will continue to be disproportionately affected by the crisis, as have other groups. And this issue of exacerbated divides is a potential problem that we need to pay attention to.
Fantastic. So much we could dive into there, Rob. So we're going to come back to lots of that. Thank you for those initial thoughts. I want to shift gears and ask Sabrina to comment on WWF and of course, where it's been seeing innovation and its involvement in this arena.
Yeah, thank you, Denise, and thank you, Helen and Rob, for the introductions as well. It's I might just dial back a bit to just a bit of an introduction. I know people often wonder why WWF as a conservation NGO works so much on food, and just if we can maybe move to the next slide, just focusing on obviously there's an urgent need, beyond the current crisis that we're living, for change and for innovation in our food system. And it's really just if I might add just one point, what's been shared already on all the teachings that we've been having is, I think the crisis is also shedding some light on how our current food and agriculture system is really driving habitat loss and creating the conditions for future viruses to emerge and spread. And early evidence is already showing very clearly that zoonotic events like the coronavirus pandemic have increased over the past 30 years, and largely driven by the way we're using land, because we're destroying more and more natural habitat, particularly tropical forests, and we're converting it for agriculture, but also how we're producing food. And here I think it's mainly how we're farming and how we're selling domestic animals. Over the past 30 years, again, have dramatically increased the number of species we're farming. And thirdly, how we're using wild animals. We're now farming, trafficking, trading, selling wild animals for pets, for food, medicine, status, at a level that we've never really done before. And all of this is really accelerated by climate change, which obviously the food system is a major contributor to. So the importance to really work on our food system. So we know that we're all aware that the way we currently produce and consume food is really putting an impossible strain on the planet. So I've seen it on the figures that Denise shared as well on ecosystem loss. Food production is responsible for 70% of global biodiversity loss and 75% of deforestation too. It's causing nearly a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions, 70% of the world's use of fresh water. It's really the single biggest, the sector is really the single biggest threat to nature currently. And of course, with the world population set to grow to more than 9 billion people by 2050, it's really clear that we need paradigmatic change in our food system. And so we're really excited to be speaking about innovation today in that arena. But the good news is that, and as we're seeing as well in some of the positive, a lot of community solidarity responses to the coronavirus pandemic, there are across the world huge opportunities to produce more food in a way that works with nature and not against it. And really think that if we do things differently, we can stop having forests turn into fields, keep rivers flowing, restore soil fertility, reverse the loss of variety of life on Earth. And at the same time, as was mentioned before as well, by reducing food waste and eating healthier diets, we can make sure that there's enough nutritious food for every person now and into the future. And as we were saying, and as already started to discuss, the pandemic has really highlighted just how important our food system is, and how perhaps also certain stakeholders in the food system are not valued enough usually, and this is really changing now in the current context, and it's really interesting to observe as well. And it's also highlighted how broken it is. So I've mentioned as well, seeing struggles to get food on supermarket shelves, short of a workforce to harvest food, and yeah, we're seeing huge wastage as well, with perfectly good food that's left to rot in fields. And obviously deep inequalities in the ways the crisis is affecting people. I think someone mentioned in the chat as well that that's, the crisis is really exacerbating, and Rob mentions as well, an ongoing crisis in terms of food security as well. And that's not only in developing nations, even in the UK. I think there are some recent figures from the Food Foundation that 5 million adults in the UK are facing food insecurity, with ethnic minorities most at risk. So now just, I know we're talking about SDGs and looking at forward to 2030. So just as kind of an introduction as well on WWF's work on food in particular, the 2030 outcome that we're working towards is a food system, as you can see there, which protects and conserves nature whilst ensuring there's enough nutritious food for all current and future generations. And nice to see some overlap as well in the three kind of sub-outcome areas that we focus a lot of our attention on sustainable production, food loss and waste, and sustainable diets. And all of this is, of course, all the more relevant in the context today. And of course, the role of innovation is to help drive the very deep transformations that we need in all of these areas. So if you can just move to the following slide now. So about innovation, I think very often when we think about innovation in food, we think about innovation through technology. But if we go back to the broader meaning of innovation as an idea that's translated into practical reality, I think it can mean so much more. And as I said, we really need step change, paradigmatic shifts towards a more regenerative food system rather than incremental fixes. And I don't mean to say that technology only brings incremental fixes, but this should be really the focus, whatever the means that we have to get there. And there's a quote by Bill Mollison that I think was one of the founders of permaculture that I think applies really well here. That's though the problems of the world are increasingly complex, the solutions remain embarrassingly simple. And I wanted to share, just in the introduction here, a few examples of the work that WWF UK is doing in terms of innovation in food systems, and again, not only in the field of technology, but just broader innovation. So the first example is, so driving market action broadly is one of our priorities. So for example, some of you may know that a couple of years ago, we entered into a partnership with Tesco with the long-term aim of halving the environmental footprint of the average UK shopping basket and restoring nature in food production. We've also had huge reaction from other retailers across the world to join us and see how they can collaborate and help drive impact globally as well. And we've launched a basket metric methodology with Tesco to better understand this footprint and then measure, sorry about the background noise, and measure our progress towards having it. And also as part of this partnership, there's really a piece that's focused entirely on innovation. So we're developing an innovation index, which is a long list of late stage, market-ready innovations that are relevant to the food system that have the potential to drive sustainability impact at scale. So we're looking into potentially hopefully game-changing innovations in the fields of sustainable agriculture, deforestation, marine ecosystems, and climate change. And then the objective is to use Tesco supply chains, WWF's brand strength, and also some financial support to remove any blockages from these late-stage innovations from being more widely scaled up. And our intention is also to make a version of the index publicly available to maximize its impact. So now, shortlisted. I'm not yet able to share much detail about each of the innovations, but we're shortlisted a dozen of innovations at this stage. And so we've got product innovations, which are very much the technological type innovations, but also business model and process innovations. And we're assessing their feasibility at the moment with a view to publish the index in the next month or two. And now for the second example, so looking at the upstream part of supply chains now, WWF is also pioneering some really interesting work around land use governance innovations. And I think, yeah, there's a whole field of innovations in the field of governance that are very much needed. And one key example of that would be in general landscape and jurisdictional approaches that we've been hearing more and more about over the past years, which can encompass very different mechanisms, but in essence, they bring regional stakeholders together in a bounded landscape to agree on and implement a shared approach to more sustainable use of natural resources in the landscape and land use management. And one of the key landscapes that we're working in is the Cerrado in Brazil, which is a really critical biome that's home to 5% of global biodiversity. It's also the world's largest deforestation frontier. And in the Cerrado, WWF is co-developing an innovative financial mechanism this time to promote conservation. So we played a key role in raising now nearly 15 million pounds towards supporting soy farmers in the Cerrado to incentivize production on existing agricultural land and stopping deforestation and habitat conversion, in which is a really precious biome. And then finally, the third example, I think there's also an urgent need to focus innovation on the ways in which we partner and collaborate across sectors. So all about SDG 17, I guess. And as an example of this type of work, WWF UK has had a huge hand in initiating and informing the UK's Global Resource Initiative, so GRI there on the slide. That's a task force that UK government has commissioned to understand how the UK could eliminate its import of deforestation through commodity supply chains and tackle its global environmental footprint. And we've actually just published last Friday the executive summary of a report called Riskier Business that's helping inform this work and one of the key findings that it shows that 88% of the UK's land area is required overseas to supply the UK with just 7 commodities. And so these are just a few examples, and of course there are so many other promising areas of much needed innovation in food and agriculture, which we've already started to discuss and really looking forward to continuing to discuss today. So yeah, I'll stop here for now, but really happy to discuss in more detail.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sabrina. Thanks for putting so much color and specifics to some of those. I think, if I will, we've got quite an active Q&A box going on there with lots of different questions. But if I will, I want to pose one to you all first. I think you picked up on it, Sabrina, around technology. But, you know, a lot of people do look to technology and innovations there for kind of being the silver bullet, for being the solution that's going to save us. I'm curious from all of you, you know, do you believe in the area of food, our greatest innovations yet to come will be in technology? Or is it perhaps about implementing what we know works, you know, throughout value chains, getting best practice to become standard practice? Curious, you know, or something else. How do you see technology? I saw a visible reaction from Rob. Do you want to come in?
Yeah, so both. I think, you know, the idea that technology, some form of technology can be a silver bullet is perhaps a bit misplaced. I think the first thing to say about innovations, it starts with mindset. The mindsets of how we run our businesses, how we run our partnerships and collaborations. You know, one of the things that I can speak to here, which I was struck by, is that in Nestle there's an innovation process that we go through, and there were 12 steps in it. I mean, you know, that hardly leads to fast innovation. That model of how we go about things has been radically rethought. So it's down to, I can't remember the exact number, I think it's about 5 gates that a thing has to go through before it can get to market. So that kind of, you know, do we have to check everything before we take a risk and put something out there? No, we don't. So the mindset has to change. So I think relying on technology is risky, but I do think there are other interesting things that are going on in technology, you know, whether it's in blockchain or big data or in AI. You know, I'll give you another example. I mean, from a deforestation point of view, you know, we've partnered up with people with regard to satellite monitoring for deforestation. It's made a huge impact on what we can focus on and where we can focus in targeted ways more quickly. We're looking at the same thing in actually applying it in social dimensions as well. So, you know, obviously there's always risks with technology as well, that there will be increasing opportunities, but we can't think that's the answer. We have to start with ourselves.
Interesting. Curious, Helen, Sabrina, any reactions to Rob's thoughts or your own views on technology versus other measures?
Well, I'm sure neither of us would disagree that innovation, technology is unlikely to be a silver bullet, but I think there's certain technologies that have been talked about for some time, especially in agriculture when it comes to precision agriculture, the ability to use drones to find weeds, to then maybe use electricity to zap their roots and all these clever things where you don't need a pesticide. You know, there's often a tipping point with technologies where they didn't look like they were financially doable, or that there was a consumer interest in taking the product of those technologies. And I think a lot of the assumptions that we have had as to what consumers may find of interest to them, that they would you know, want to wrap their arms around and get more interested in, may well change. And I think there was already, you know, a huge upsurge in interest around sustainable diets, for example. And I imagine that if there was when all this started, I was just about to take up the position of president of the Institute of Food Science and Technology, and our conference was had to be cancelled. So I did a little video in my kitchen, which was relayed then through a webinar like this. And I said that one of the things that I thought would be an incredible positive to come out of this is that people would take the food supply chain less for granted than maybe they had over the last few years, and that the people associated with it and the technologies involved in it would be something that people would really take an interest in. and the way that food comes to them would be something that they would actively want to know more about. And I think that is a potentially a real positive that can come out of this, and that people will care more. And we all know that many people can't afford the food that they would like to purchase, but for those who can make good choices, educated, informed choices about food, then they are likely to ask more and more questions about how that food has come to them. And if technologies can deliver the type of food that they're after, it probably has more potential to deliver now than it ever has done. And I think there'll be more interest from a diversity of from businesses, from NGOs, from all of society to get involved in moving some of these forward. And we'll probably see more cross-fertilization of ideas from one sector to another. And we mustn't forget about important things like energy and you know, obviously the environmental impacts, which we knew from talking to our members and getting involved in things was already becoming a real societal interest. So I think it permits technology to have an impact even more than it ever did.
Okay, interesting. A lot there to unpack. And Sabrina, curious, you're nodding, and you kind of introduced this concept of, you know, complex problems but very simple solutions, with particularly technology being put in the bucket of being complex often. But
yeah, no, I completely agree with also what Rob and Helen have shared. I think it's just, yeah, technology is not that silver bullet that might solve everything, and there's so much you know, work on the enabling factors that would allow perhaps certain technological solutions to have, you know, wider impact at a larger scale around, you know, I mentioned governance, but policy and finance and individual behaviors and mindsets. But I think there are, of course, there are some really interesting technological innovations that are really interesting to watch. I think something that I've been following with a lot of interest is all the work around alternatives to high-risk commodities. That there's really interesting work on alternatives to, you know, using fermentation processes for alternatives to soy or palm oil as well, alternatives to rubber using dandelion and other crops, and there's, you know, it's really interesting innovations. Rob also mentioned, yeah, satellite imagery to fight deforestation. There's a lot of work in the space. Drones, also Helen mentioned. Obviously, all of this, anything that enables more transparency, more traceability, data-related innovations more broadly, just to help people make more informed decisions. Anything that helps connect consumers to producers. There is a lot of really exciting work in the technological space going on that we really need to follow carefully. But I think in themselves, without paying that attention to the broader enabling environments, they definitely won't be silver bullets.
Interesting. I want to kind of shape a question here that's a bit of a follow-up to what I've heard, but also trying to weave in some of the different questions we're getting in the chat box here. So I want to take a phrase from Helen around, you know, the current situation being an opportunity perhaps to remodel our food system. So if we take that kind of remodeling a food system concept, and we also, I think you pointed out to some of the innovations around, say, the packaging challenge, where, you know, moving to, you know, people bringing their own containers and filling their own containers, moving away from packaging. And that might be now at odds with what we're learning about hygiene and what consumers will expect, but also what will make them confident in you know, going back and consuming. So that's kind of one example. But what are these kind of any areas that you see as particularly ripe for innovation, any innovations we need to rethink? And I might add to that the question around circularity. So someone asked specifically, you know, what kind of circular measures are being put in place, and how do you measure anything that's particularly circular? The person is also interested to make sure that we avoid any false claims around any of these new concepts and ideas. But curious if this idea of remodeling would spur any thoughts.
Shall I give it a first go? So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that people have certainly been doing is thinking more being more conscious about the purchases that they make, and being more careful to use all of the things that they purchase. And with RAP, who do a lot of the work in the UK around food waste, for example, are seeing, I mentioned this in the introduction, seeing some encouraging changes whereby people are wasting less food, they're reusing it. If they, do a roast on a Sunday, then they're doing a casserole on a Monday and a soup on a Wednesday or whatever, which are, we've talked about these things a lot before. And of course, for a lot of people, they have got a little bit more time at the moment to investigate and get back to basics a bit more with food. And there is this interest, I think, I'm sure you've all heard about the number of searches for certain recipes online that have become incredibly popular as people have tried to do things that they haven't done for many years. And you still can't buy yeast at the moment, apparently, because everyone's making bread. But so I think there's probably a remodeling of how the consumer thinks about the food. And then when it comes to packaging, I mean, I certainly believe that plastic has almost been a victim of its own success, in that it's just being used way too widely. And I think all of the work that was going on before this happened to try and work out ways to incorporate more recycled materials, to make sure that circularity of getting material that has been used back into another product, that will all be still going on, because that's something that hygiene wise is fine, because you take something that's been used once and you melt it down and you create it into a second thing, and all hygienically that's absolutely fine. And of course, plastic is very capable of being in this circular economy, and so we have to refocus on some of those things. I think one of the things that is a bit problematic at the moment is that the oil price is so low, so that's actually making the economic models for not using virgin materials quite difficult, because you do have to put a lot of effort, money and infrastructure into collecting materials and then reprocessing them. And so those economic models are becoming quite difficult, and that's something that we'll really need to think about as to how we overcome some of those things. I'm sure oil prices will go back up again, but at the moment it is quite difficult, and even, as we know, the infrastructure for collection is difficult. But plastics do a great job, and they keep shelf life, and we know that a good shelf life is important when supply chains are more challenged. But we just need to keep them for the things that they're really needed for, and not use them for all the other stuff that we've tended to get into the habit of. Anyway, I'll let the others have their go.
Absolutely, think so.
Yeah, just on that point about plastics, just to build on that a little bit, Helen, I think you're absolutely right. There's a reason why plastics are widely used, and there have been some disastrous unintended consequences. One of the outcomes of this pandemic is absolutely food safety, not just about shelf life, it's also about food safety. And that will, I think, potentially have an increase in the use of some single-use packaging. Now, that in itself may not necessarily be a bad thing if you've got recycling facilities available. But it's not just about the recycling facilities being available, it's the availability then of recycled food-grade plastics. And that's, I hadn't realized this until relatively recently, that the availability of food-grade recycled content is very, very low indeed. And it's one of the reasons why Nestle invested so much money recently in terms of trying to stimulate a market for recycled food-grade plastics. We've got an initiative to pay above the odds, so to speak, to try and stimulate suppliers to make it more available. So yeah, that is a challenge. So too are recycling facilities, as we know, and the consistency of them. And that then perhaps leads to another of the questions that came up on the chat, which was around ensuring that circularity is a term that actually really means something. And I couldn't agree more about that. I think there's a terrible risk that circularity and branding circularity meets branding, and you end up with something that could be very misleading to consumers. So I think that some kind of commonly agreed norms around circularity would be very, very welcome. There's some stuff on the thing around regenerative and around obesity as well, which we may have time to get to. If we do, that would be great. But I'll pause there and hand back to you, Denise.
Yeah, absolutely. Want to get there. Curious, Sabrina, if you want to come in on anything on this point before we introduce some others.
Maybe just very brief. I think that's, the plastics point is a really good illustration of the fact that the point that you made in the introduction as well, Denise, on holistic approaches and systems thinking. I think it's just it's so important in any kind of context, but in food systems, I think it's always a good reminder to think that we need to move beyond silos and for example, single indicators to measure. Obviously we have yields in agricultural production systems, but increasingly we're carbon is something that we can measure and that we use a lot as an indicator, but there's a lot of innovations that would be fascinating to see develop further on measuring very precisely and in a really robust science-based way the impacts of certain production systems and other areas of the supply chain on other environmental indicators as well. And there's a lot of work going on in that space on biodiversity and soil health and water. And to really just always think of, these are complex problems. Plastic is a great illustration, and there's so much that needs to be thought about. And obviously now food safety of course, is increasingly important in the equation as well. And just on the point on circularity and regenerative design, I think in these things there's so much as well. Going back to the simple solutions, there's so much traditional knowledge as well on practices. If you think about production, in particular agricultural production, that already exists and that are really simple and don't necessarily need to be high tech. For example, agroforestry or cover cropping, using green manures to just using a crop to just restore soil fertility and not necessarily to have, and these are approaches that have existed for a long time, that have the potential to address these multiple metrics, but we just haven't found a way to measure that precisely enough yet to enable them to be upscaled in certain scenarios.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's, yes, probably tactics we're aware of, but haven't scaled. I do want to introduce very diverse topics on the chat. So maybe introduce 4 different prompts and let each of you come in on at least response maybe to one of them. So one is around, what does regenerative mean to you? So they're picking up on, I think, the concepts that we've been hearing about, and perhaps like circularity, interested on maybe how we would align on what regenerative means. There's a question around overconsumption relating to the obesity point. So how do we tackle overconsumption without stigmatizing and discriminating against people? Very specific topic. Another question is around, what do you think is next for food security in the UK? Noting that's a big topic. And there's also one, maybe one we'll have to take offline, but there's interest to know whether anyone is aware of your organizations or others supporting the mental health of particularly farmers and those raising animals who've been at the front lines of some of the disruption in the food system, had to euthanize animals or perhaps see the loss of their crops due to the current situation. So it may be an extension of that people point of how you're supporting mental health for those at the front lines of food in a way. So hopefully there's something maybe for everyone in that mashup before we wrap up.
Well, I'm happy to take a first run at a couple of those, Denise, if I can. So on the regenerative point, I would say I think it's a really good observation that it's one of those terms that gets thrown around quite a lot. And actually, when you drill into it, what do we really mean by it? And there is a concept of regenerative economics. And if anybody is super interested to find out, it's kind of all of what that means, I would strongly recommend that you pay attention to the work of a guy called John Fullerton. You can Google him and you'll find a load of stuff. John's written various books on the topic. So that would be my go-to there. Personally speaking, I much prefer to talk about restorative, because regenerative, if you drill into it, you're kind of looking to do something that is actually really rather difficult. You kind of want to get more out than you've put in, and I'm not sure that always that's a doable proposition. I personally find the idea of restorative, given the challenges that we face and the mess that some of our communities and countries are in, from an agricultural point of view, not only agricultural, restorative to my mind is a much more positive and easy to embrace term. make things better. On the overconsumption point and obesity, we've been strong backers at Nestle of the Nutri-Score system, which is not the model in the UK. I'm not saying that that is the answer. I don't think it is the answer. I think that there's an awful lot more, though, that we need to understand around the science of obesity. There's far too little understanding what actually causes it. I mean, one of the things we're known for is our first 1,000 days work, and much of what we understand, much of what we see in terms of obesity could very well actually be traced back to things that happen in the first 1,000 days of life and how the body metabolizes food. So, there's a science here that we absolutely need to know more about. It isn't as simple as calories in, calories out, do more exercise. That can help for sure, but there's a lot more to it than that. So I'll leave it there. I have a point of view about the UK, but I'll probably get a bit political if I did that. So maybe I should leave that one for Helen.
Excellent.
The trouble is the reason I say that is because I spend too much time enjoying farming today with the hour time difference over here.
I enjoy farming today, and I'm in the UK.
Well, you get up earlier than I do then.
Well, I'm awake. I mean, one of the things I think has been very refreshing about everything that has gone on, good things do come out of bad situations, and there has been a huge generosity, I think, in the way that people have shared their ideas and have been willing to do things differently. And we've seen collaborations across different parts of the sector that we've never seen before, partly because actually competition law has been slightly relaxed to help all of this. But I think Rob mentioned right at the beginning about the impact on hospitality, and we can expect that to go on for some considerable time, I think. And we've certainly seen that there are now restaurants that are doing meal kits that people can cook at home, and you've certainly got farm shops that have become way more popular than they ever were. And I certainly have one in my area where not only does she sell the things that she makes in her farm, but she gets stuff from the vegetable growers nearby, and people are just they are willing to pay more because they feel part of supporting that local community. Now, I'm not going to say that buying local and shopping local and everything else is going to fix all of the problems going forward, but I think that this way that people have worked together to collaborate, and I like goal 17 in the SDGs around partnerships for the gold. I think that is where one of the key areas is, and I know that in terms of funding, that UKRI have got some funding around at the moment on transforming UK food systems for healthy people and healthy environments. The whole piece about healthy people and healthy environments, there is a sweet spot in here where we need to understand more, and I think that can help with some of the questions. And when it comes to health, people will certainly think about food and health. We're already seeing them thinking about how food might be a way that if their body was healthier, they would be able to fend off, they would have a stronger immune system, would be able to fend off viruses. Oh, I know that this is very complicated about nutrition and health claims and all the rest of it. Don't get me started on that. But if people are thinking beyond simplistically about skinny versus overweight, etc., and actually about mental health and physical health and how food can support them in doing that, that would be fantastic too.
But so much there, multifaceted food and health there. Sabrina, I want to give you a chance to come in, and I will do a quick recap, hopefully in our final moment together.
All right, I'll be brief because I know we're almost at the top of the hour, but fully aligned with what Helen and Rob have shared. And it's just also a good reminder that, the crisis has really offered us a glimpse into what more resilient food systems might look like. Lots of communities have really come together to help plug gaps in food systems. In some instances, even authorities taking really extraordinary steps to secure production and distribution. But yeah, there's always this risk that, as often happens in times of crisis, that we go back to business as usual. So yeah, hopefully it's a good starting point. Yeah, for really pragmatic transformation. But I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Well, I feel terrible in a way cutting all of you off because it's a fascinating discussion, and I know some of our participants have really appreciated it as well. But just to highlight some of the concepts that we covered, started talking about access and affordability, remodeling the system, shift in mindsets, what we can do at the landscape level, alternative commodities and markets, partnerships, technology, education, circularity, regeneration, or restorative. So many concepts, I think, that give signals into different areas of innovation we hope to see. So final plug again, if you are potentially an innovation and a pioneer that deserves this great Zayed Sustainability Prize to support that innovation and get it going, please do take a look. Applications are due in just a few short weeks. I hope you all took something away from the conversation and the insights into food and agriculture, and join me in thanking Sabrina, Rob, and Helen for their time and insights today. It's been a real pleasure to be a part of the discussion.
Thank you, Denise. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Denise.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.
Take care and stay safe where you are, and we'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.